First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. This is the very first time Heart of a Nation has opened up one of its international discussion forums to an audience beyond our committee members. It certainly won't be the last. Our plan is to host 1 or 2 Zoom discussions, Zoom forums each and every month, certainly through the end of the year. Then we'll recalibrate and based on feedback, determine whether to proceed more frequently or less frequently than that. But we already have speakers scheduled once or twice a month through the end of December. For those of you who are not yet familiar with Heart of a Nation, I'd encourage you to go to our website. Easy to find us at heartofanation.io. That's the tricky part, .io. And for those who are looking to get more involved with Heart of a Nation, the intentional community of purpose, please contact us through the website as well. For most of us on this call, this is a time of remembrance. A couple of days ago, we were thinking about events that transpired 20 years ago and every day since. But for a small number on this call, today is also a very significant anniversary because today is the 28th anniversary of the historic handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the South Lawn of the White House. And for those of us who were there in attendance, September 13th will always be a very significant inflection point, not because it changed everything in the way that the people in Oslo and Washington were hoping and dreaming it would, but because the things before and the things after are measured differently. But here we are 28 years after the historic handshake, marking the accords that came out of Oslo. And what a terrific time to take stock of how things are going in the Middle East. And before you absolutely dismiss the Middle East as absolutely beyond repair, I think you'll want to lean into this conversation particularly, because when I first met John Lyndon, I was literally blown away by all of the individuals, the activists, the thought leaders, the organizers, the organizations that had remained consistently involved in the pursuit of building a constituency for negotiated settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over these last almost 3 decades. It's also interesting to note that today of all days, we see the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt coming together in the Sinai for the first time in a very, very long time. The leaders of Israel and Egypt coming together. We know that a short time ago, the Prime Minister met with the new President of the United States, and the Defense Minister was in Ramallah meeting with Abu Mazen. Half a dozen Democratic senators have just returned from the region feeling more optimistic than anyone expected them to. This forum will run 1 hour, exactly from 1 to 2 Eastern Standard Time. For those who are looking for an opportunity to continue and expand the conversation, please let us know. We will find ample opportunities to do so. This forum is being recorded, and the intention is that it will be transcribed and distributed to just about 1,000 thought leaders and activists from Palestine, Israel, and the United States who have a particular interest in this subject matter. John, I'm about to turn things over to you, and I'm not going to take any more time with introducing the topic or introducing you or introducing the 2 magnificent activists that you've invited to join us today, because I'm really hoping that you and the others will have an opportunity to work biographical information into your presentation, into the responses to the questions that we expect in just about half an hour. But I would begin by asking you, John, why are you so involved in the search for peace and justice in the Middle East? As far as I know, that's not where you were born. That's not where most of your family resides, neither in Israel nor Palestine. And if I'm not mistaken, you've come to this with an enormous amount of experience with a very intractable, seemingly intractable conflict far from the Middle East. So maybe, John, you can begin there, help us understand your background, introduce the two activists you've asked to join in this conversation. Tell us a bit about ALLMEP, your remarkable organization, and why we're all so excited about the legacy legislation that Nita Lowey bequeathed the region.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks everybody for joining. And yeah, I mean, if people find me a little bit difficult to follow, it's because I talk a little bit too fast, but also because my accent. I'm from Ireland, I think, as Jonathan was alluding to a little bit earlier. And it is interesting on the 28th anniversary of the Oslo Accords to sort of acknowledge that I'm the net beneficiary of a very successful peace process on the island of Ireland as well, which happened at around the same time with some of the same people involved, including President Clinton, but which had now, with 28 years hindsight, very different legacy and more lasting thus far results for the key stakeholders. And it's interesting to actually look at the why around that. I mean, Irish Catholics and Protestants are no different to Israelis and Palestinians, but they were two very different peace processes. And one of the big differences was when Oslo arrived 28 years ago, even some of the people who were most plugged into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were shocked and surprised, not just about the contents of the accords and the declaration of principles, but even just the fact that the PLO and the government of Israel were in a room directly negotiating things which had been taboo. I mean, it was illegal for the PLO on the Israeli side, for anyone to meet with the PLO. So this was really a game-changing event, but it arrived like a monolith out of space. And unfortunately, for reasons we're all familiar with, it then eroded and ultimately, I think, fell apart really in the years that followed for many reasons. But one of them is instructive as we look at the comparison with Northern Ireland. And it was that in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, which came about in 1998, was preceded by 12 years of very intense incremental peace building work to create conditions that allowed conflict resolution to become ripe. So we have in this kind of test case in the 1990s, these two opposing theories of conflict resolution that were tried in a time. I mean, I'm quite nostalgic for the 90s. It was a time when people really tried to solve big, difficult, deep international problems. I hope we have a time like that again. And one of the reasons things are more successful in Northern Ireland was because of something called the International Fund for Ireland. So this was a huge, very ambitious institution, which invested well over $2 billion in direct and leveraged investments into peace building on the island of Ireland. Now, to put that into comparison, in the Israeli-Palestinian space, we only really started investing in peace building work after Oslo. In fact, after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, when arguably the peace process was unfortunately already dead. And we never did it at that same sort of scale. It was around $40 per person per year for 20 years in Northern Ireland. And it's under $2 per person per year for Israelis and Palestinians. And as I mentioned, commencing much later. So the International Fund for Ireland was what Jonathan Powell, the chief negotiator for Tony Blair, called the great unsung hero of the peace process. George Mitchell, sadly unwell at the moment, but an envoy to both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to Northern Ireland, said that he wouldn't have taken the job from President Clinton if not for the capacity that had been generated over that previous decade or so. And what you saw was this mushrooming of ideas, of people, of energies that managed to bridge some of the gaps in trust that we know are so critical for conflict resolution, but also create some of the ideas and the policy architecture that inform the Good Friday Agreement. So the parity of esteem idea at the center of that document was a civil society project before it was adopted by political leaders. In Northern Ireland, there was a referendum on the peace process, and the politicians were too scared to campaign directly themselves. So it was instead subcontracted to the civil society organizations that US leadership had funded over the preceding decade. And now we have a situation where some of the most ambitious politicians in Northern Ireland, really bridging the sectarian divide, are alumni of those programs. So from soup to nuts, this was a conflict resolution theory that put civic and economic tools at the very center. And as I mentioned, in Israel-Palestine, we haven't really seen that until now. So as Jonathan mentioned, I'm the executive director of ALLMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and we're the largest network of peacebuilding NGOs working amongst Israelis and Palestinians, both inside Israel for a more just and equitable relationship between Jewish and Arab citizens, and then also cross-border between Israelis and Palestinians. We have over 150 members. I'll put a link in the chat. You can take a look. It's a lot of organizations you may have heard of, others you may not have. Huda Abuarquob, our regional director, is joining us on the call today as well. She works at the coalface in the region. One of the reasons she's a little late today is she's coming back from meetings in Jerusalem with the community. And this is really the core of our work, is directly with those members to make them more than the sum of their parts. The other part of our work is to advocate to governments right around the world for far greater investment in this sort of programming, taking the lesson from Northern Ireland as one of those data points. And we're delighted to say that after nearly a decade and a half of advocacy around this international fund concept, saying, why can't we apply this same tool to the Israeli-Palestinian sphere? We saw game-changing legislation enacted in the final days of last year called the Nida M. Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, named for former chairwoman Lowy, who was chair of the Appropriations Committee, and really helped to drive this legislation through and get the kind of bipartisan support that we know is so difficult to come by, but is integral and necessary for anything that really moves the needle on this issue and many others. And it will now see $250 million over the next 5 years being invested in civic and economic tools and programs that can create the conditions that we know are necessary for conflict resolution. In fact, it's great, not only is today the anniversary of the Oslo Accords, it's good timing for another reason, in that 10 days ago, the first call for the Lowy Fund was published, a $15 million public call for peacebuilding organizations with a maximum grant size of $5 million. We've never seen this before. This is the single biggest funding line in the history of Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding. But the good news is it's only the start. And even within this fiscal year, we are expecting greater amounts of money to enter the field and to really try and regenerate a field that has been diminished to a great extent over recent years. People will be familiar, of course, of the cuts that President Trump initiated in 2018. But even before that, peacebuilding support from the US government and from many others has been declining year on year since 2013. So we need to build up the muscle again, make sure that these peacebuilding organizations don't just get back to where they were a decade or so ago, because we know that was insufficient. They need to go very far past that point and create a situation where participation in the sort of programs that Meredith and Huda are going to talk to you about become not just kind of a very rare privilege for most Israelis and Palestinians, but a rite of passage, something that every Israeli and Palestinian can engage in. And I think in this moment, as we look at the aftermath of Oslo and its collapse, it's also time for new ideas. And one of the tragedies of the last couple of decades is that ideas have been cooked up in silos on either side of the green line. So that in their first contact with reality, the cross-border reality, because ultimately peace isn't a function of what you can pass in the Knesset or what the Palestinian legislature sit again can agree to. It has to be a function of what Israelis and Palestinians can agree to. And we have essentially cut the bonds between both people for many, many reasons. But we hope now that this funding can begin to rebuild them and create an engine room for those sort of ideas, and also for those leaders who can emerge from those rooms and can incentivize their political leaders to adopt some of those norms. And if they don't adopt them, perhaps replace them. And we can see maybe a generation of Israeli-Palestinian peace builders over time move into positions of political leadership, and again, in a way we've been lucky to see in Northern Ireland. So as I mentioned, we're lucky to be joined by both Meredith and Huda as well. So Meredith is the co-founder and CEO of a partner of ours called Amal Tikva. Now I'll let Meredith explain the work in a bit more detail, but her work is incredible. Based in Jerusalem, bringing together lots of organizations that you'll hear from, and really trying to increase capacity, innovation, and partnership across the field, and to make sure that with these resources coming, we begin to see the sort of ideas and creative thinking that we know is necessary. And Meredith, I just thought maybe to open up the conversation, I wanted to ask you, as we know, as I mentioned, the funding is coming. This is very good news, but money and resources are only one part of the puzzle. And I think, as you were saying to the House Foreign Affairs Committee in a hearing earlier in the summer, there is a lot of ingenuity and energy and ideas out there in the field. And I wonder, can you talk us through what you think are some of the most exciting and innovating ideas out there that could potentially be ready to scale?
Thanks, John, and thank you, Jonathan, for the invitation, and everybody for being here. I'm Meredith. I'm the head of Amal Tikva. We sit in Jerusalem, and I'm very lucky to be working with a lot of the organizations on the ground who had not previously, over the last few years, really been ready to receive major funds, but we've been working very closely with them and with other partners to try to get them to a place that their models are scalable, so that when this funding arrives, they'd be ready. I'll never forget the moment that I was stuck in traffic in East Jerusalem about 3 years ago, and John called me panicked. And he said, "You have to listen to me. Something really important is happening." I said, "Yes." And at the time, I was consulting privately for a few organizations trying to work on building organizational capacity. He said, "We're really going to get this money. So I need you to get the field ready." And I said, "All right, it's going to be fine. You get the money, John, and we'll make sure that on the ground, the organizations are ready to scale and they're ready to receive it." And so that's really been our mandate. My colleagues and I here have, we started Amal Tikva just 2 years ago, and we began with 6 months of intensive mapping, meeting with all of the peace organizations that we could find, asking them about their history, how they've grown, who their leadership was, who they are now, why they're doing what they're doing, their theories of change, their vision, how they operate, what are their challenges, everything. And we mapped. We asked donors who are giving, who aren't giving, who used to give, who might start giving, and try to understand really the whole picture of peace building. At that point, we came back to ALLMEP and to some of our other partners to figure out how we can get the field from where it was 2 years ago to a place that was, this funding arrived, there would be many more organizations with incredible models. Just last night, I was on the phone with Tech to Peace, for example, who is an incredible organization. Maybe John, if you want to link to them, who are bringing together young Israeli and Palestinian leaders between the ages 22 and 30 to learn tech skills and create projects together. They are constantly having hackathons and developing different programs together, and they've become a direct feeder into another organization called 50/50 Startups, which is incubating Israeli-Palestinian companies that are creating tech solutions, not necessarily conflict related, but cross-border issues that is critical to have Israeli and Palestinian business partnerships. And so these are just two examples of the innovative relationships that we're having. Now, it's not always tech and interesting, sexy ideas that are the most innovative. There's also other models, such as Lisan, one of the organizations we're working with, who started as a group of Israeli college students working with a group of women from a village called Issawiyah, which is right next to Mount Scopus and at Hebrew University, who wanted to learn Hebrew so that they could become more employable inside Jerusalem. And the organization has grown. They have over 20 classes with up to 30 women per class per year, meeting weekly. And they are bringing women from little to no Hebrew up to a completely working proficient level. They realized that they needed to perfect their models. And after turning to other ulpans and other Hebrew classes, they realized that the way that they're operating isn't really the same. And they actually partnered with an organization called Madraseh, which is teaching Arabic to Israelis. And these two organizations realized that they were perfectly complementary in terms of their models, and they're sharing. And this sort of partnership is really what we're seeing today. I'll just end my comment with one more piece, which is that many of you will remember a few years ago when Peacebuilding lost USAID funding, and it was a very trying time at the end of 2018. After the move of the embassy to Jerusalem and the anti-normalization movement making it very difficult for Palestinian participation, as well as many other political factors such as annexation on the table and increased violence, we had gotten to a point as peace builders, the organizations shrunk, and the people that are left, that stayed in it now, leading these incredible organizations with movements, are in it with every single ounce of their being. And that's why they're being so successful today.
Excellent. Thank you, Meredith. And we're also lucky to be joined by Huda Abuarquob, who's the regional director, as I mentioned, for ALLMEP, based just outside of Hebron. Huda, for those who haven't met her before, is a force of nature. I think one of the most important, I'm going to embarrass you now, Huda, thought leaders in the peace building space in general, and certainly helping to drive forward some of the Palestinian-led innovation that we know is integral to real change. And Huda, what I wanted to ask you, and just to be really direct about this, we've noticed with funding before that understandably some of it goes disproportionately towards Israeli organizations for a variety of reasons, including the capacity to write proposals and some of the institutional capacities that are there. And I think we're really keen to see the greatest share possible of this money to go towards Palestinian-led initiatives that can really reshape the reality that you're working with and dealing with every day. And I just wonder, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your sense of that capacity and this opportunity for real innovation and renewal amongst Palestinian cross-border civil society?
Thank you, John, and I apologize for being late, but also I apologize for being tired. So if I'm coherent, excuse me, incoherent, excuse me. So we fortunately have finished our, as ALLMEP, we finished our needs assessment that was focused only on the Palestinian partners in the peace building field. And I want to be very careful about terminology here, because this is one of the things that we uncovered in that needs assessment. And I'm happy at some point to share some of the info of that needs assessment. But the rationale behind doing it is exactly what John stated in his remarks, is that there has been heavily concentration coming from especially Jewish foundations on raising the capacity of shared society organizations, both Palestinian and Israeli partners within the borders of before 1967, but not for the Palestinians who are part of the cross-border scene, or the Palestinian organizations who have a different definition of people to people. And we've noticed for a long time, as a Palestinian activist, I've noticed always that we need to be the subcontractors. We have to be the subcontractors, because most of our organizations didn't have the capacity even to manage funds. And since 2014, when ALLMEP had its own office in the region, we started changing that on different levels. We started first with the donor community by asking them to do, like USAID is one of the biggest donors in the region, and the EU, number 2. We asked them to do some information sessions directed towards the Palestinians. And we recruited Palestinian organizations that are not necessarily part of ALLMEP at that time, but they became later on part of ALLMEP. So the strategy was to give them an opportunity to do these information sessions with USAID and EU, but also be aware of the fact that ALLMEP exists on the ground. So that was for us important. And since then, we made it a strategy for us to purposely recruit more Palestinian organizations who want to move to the cross-border space. And so we just finished our needs assessment, and I would share with you some of the findings. It's not going to be long, I promise you guys. So we have the number one need that was identified by the Palestinian organizations and leaders is the need for planning, monitoring, and evaluation, because it's the key thing when it comes to either getting the funds, writing proposals, or even evaluating, writing reports afterwards. We also identified a need that has to do with identity, clear vision and mission and theory of change, regaining agency and legitimacy within the field, mobilizing cross-border balance between Israelis and Palestinian teams, defining strengths and weaknesses of both, formulating identity in terms of the individuals who are participating, chances for successful cooperation and strategic partnerships. And I'm just naming few. And the third was resource development. And resource development can also mean working with big donors about deconstructing the jargons they use, the fact that we don't have enough staff or staff is dedicated to fundraising. Again, linking it to PM and E. And the last one had to do with visibility. We need to be visible, and we need a language that speaks to our constituencies, but also speaks to the world about how peace building is framed by the Palestinians in this space. And we started actually with creating a Palestinian group working on language, terminology, framing peace building from a Palestinian perspective, in which we have Palestinians from the shared society participating with Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza within the space of peace building. Now, even the word peace building might not define all the organizations who are under our umbrella. Some of them want to be identified as people to people, others want to do direct action, others think that education is the best way to change the dynamics. Others believe that high tech is the only approach to changing the dynamics. We don't need to mention peace. I kid you not, peace is a dirty word in this context, Israelis and Palestinians. And so we need to find a way to reclaim peace as a legitimate way of doing, and bear with me here for using the very charged term resistance. Resistance meaning Palestinians and Israelis working together to change oppressive dynamics, both sides and systems in both sides. And in that space, you find people who want to join, and you find people who are terrified with the term resistance because of the baggages that is carrying. But again, our role as ALLMEP regional office, but international ALLMEP also, is to have the space, convene the space, and give our members and leaders a chance to get out of their comfort zone and start thinking of the issues that speaks directly to their constituencies. Because if we keep doing peace in bubbles and in closed rooms, peace is not going to happen. And that's why ALLMEP and I are big advocates of inclusivity. We even formulated a document called Feminist Inclusive Political Activism, in which we want to include everyone who can come to the tent, everyone who thinks that peace is a strategy for survival than a strategy for normalizing the occupation. So these are some of, I know this is too much, but I want to stop here because I tend to talk too much, even when I'm tired. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer more questions later on.
Thank you so much. So Meredith, maybe jumping off what Huda was saying there on inclusivity and the need for us to sort of have a strategy that stacks up. I mean, we know that peace building is very good at changing individual attitudes, and that shouldn't be diminished on its own. We have a reality now where 90% of Palestinians and 79% of Israeli Jews think it's impossible to trust with one another. So fixing that on its own is God's work, but we also need to have a strategy on how that pluses up to political change, because ultimately that's what's required to end the conflict. So I'd love to hear your thinking about how this sort of work, reimagined, can actually be a catalyst towards that sort of final status-oriented political endgame that we're all aiming toward.
And just before you jump in, Meredith, a huge thank you for Amal Tikva and Meredith for helping us also designing our needs assessment and working with us also afterwards on an Arabic module for their model. She and her staff were instrumental in this. So all the respect, kol hakavod, as we say.
Thank you, Huda. I was just going to say that one of the biggest challenges that we saw in trying to help peace organizations think big and understand the role that they can have in the bigger picture is that, you know, if they're a dialogue group or a youth program or some sort of niche way of bringing people together, the idea of making peace was just too hard, right? And even as a young director, when I led Kids for Peace several years ago, it felt every time there was an uptick in violence or a war that I failed. That if youth were attacking other youth, then what was the point, and I should just leave. And this is something that a lot of peace builders feel and have felt over time. And so I'll actually take a tangent to say that one of the things that we've been working really hard to do is support individuals that are working in this space so that they have a context within which they're working and they're getting professional development and seeing themselves as part of a movement and part of a global team. We've been, ALLMEP is hosting a Peace Builders a capacity building forum where all of the consultants, whether as NGOs or private, come together and we show unity to the NGOs, right? That we're sharing, we're opening all of our cards, we're working together, we're operating strategically as a unit for the greater good. And this is how the NGOs should be operating as well. And it's allowing all of us to work more effectively. And then as Huda mentioned, in these tools that we've been creating, the goal of it is to help the organizations of all different sizes rebuild their theories of change within a conflict analysis, that they can understand the role that they play in the bigger picture, and that every decision of a program that they run, of an activity, of a partnership, goes back to that bigger picture theory of change. And I'm going to be honest, this wasn't the case from Oslo until the last couple of years, that organizations were thinking in this way. One of the organizations we work with, Mosaica, is led by Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, who I'm sure some of you know, who always says that it can't be that we didn't make peace because we were too disorganized. And I'm going to be honest, at the state that we did our first needs assessment 2 years ago, it felt that that's actually the problem. That if we as a movement of peace builders, Israelis and Palestinians and internationals, who can really come together and focus and concentrate, and now especially that we have the MEPA funding, almost in hand with the actual resources to implement at scale, we actually can make change. And once the organizations see that and believe it and can map their own mission and vision to how it contributes toward the larger picture, and they're doing that in partner with others, and they see themselves as contributing toward a shared mission and shared language, it actually doesn't feel intractable anymore.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meredith. One more question for Huda before we open it up to the attendees. I think Jonathan will moderate a Q&A session. But Huda, just finally from me, and again, it's interesting on the anniversary of Oslo, that we know civil society can be that engine room for new ideas and fresh thinking. And I think most people would agree that's one of the things we need right now, as well as for young people to find their voice, right? And Palestine's a very young society. The average age is 19 in the West Bank and Gaza. So maybe tell me a little bit about what you see, maybe the funding coming from the Lowy Fund, but more generally, Palestinian civil society's role being in that kind of renewal and generation of new ideas, new leaders, and new energies.
Thank you, John, for that question. It's a tough one, but I'll try to do some analysis to get to the answer. So when you live in a conflict zone, that leadership on both sides is holding to the extreme views of how this conflict is going to end, and hold to old ways of thinking, you get into an impasse. And in the middle, the people who are trying to survive day by day on both sides. I cannot tell you how difficult it was for me to travel to Jerusalem today. I witnessed someone being shot on Gush Etzion round about a minute before getting there. And I saw that, and I still went to Jerusalem and I did meetings with people. So it's the challenge is on that level. You question every morning the reasons behind you being engaged in this work. So it's a challenge for the people who are part of the peace building community, but this is the only way for them to get engaged in a level that can actually change dynamics on an individual level. And the challenge is to move that transformation, what we try to fancy it by using terminology about conflict transformation. We want that transformation to happen on a larger scale, on a communal scale. And the only people who have the capacity to convene people in a room to talk about the ways to survive, ways to deal with the trauma, ways to protect your children from from educational systems that is trying to tell you that you are enemies and the other is after you, and each group is trying to push the other into the sea. I hope the sea is not going to have us all together. I mean, we will have a conflict with the creatures in the sea. Is the civil society. And if the civil society is not going to tackle these needs, again, peace is not just a word, it's a need. And we have to look at it from a needs theory, rather a needs-based theory, rather than a strategy for, building relationships, or a strategy for supporting the dominant narratives, or a strategy for getting the big shots or the elite in that conversation. Is actually a strategy for the people who have been marginalized in both societies to get engaged. And guess what? They get so empowered and they reach their potential and they start change from home. What is the challenge now for us is to give them enough power to scale that transformation to a level that can bring more communities into the conversation. And I'll give an example about that. When I was helping Women Wage Peace, which is one of our organizations, to launch itself into the Israeli society, I, as the Palestinian, was the one who insisted that they shouldn't use the word occupation in their language, because that means that they will be labeled as lefty. And again, the left is dirty and inefficient. This is not in my opinion, this is how it's viewed in that space. But also it's going to shut down many marginalized groups in the pockets of the Israeli society that are on the hard line when it comes to politics, because they are also in need for someone to protect them. And if you want to help expand the conversation, you need to find a way to get in. And if the word occupation is one of those words that will hinder that conversation, I am, as a Palestinian, for not using it. We can use ending the conflict, which in my opinion is more containing of the other issues that has to do with the occupation. The military occupation is not the only symptom of this conflict. The conflict is much bigger. And the second example is about redefining power. You live in Israel in a very militarized society. And in Palestine, there is always this seekness for some sort of heroism, because your dignity as a human being is crushed on daily basis. And you need to find a way in order to reclaim a sense of dignified being. And sometimes the only answer we get is with a rocket coming from Gaza. And I know sometimes Gaza, when it's Gaza in almost drowning in darkness, the Palestinians in the West Bank give no damn, but they cheer for the missiles coming from Gaza, not because they want to support violence, because it creates a sense of balance when it comes to terror. But this is not what we want to create in the space. And we know for sure that there are so many people that violence is not their comfort zone. And for those mothers and fathers and children and young Palestinians and Israelis who want to live in peace internally, but also in a context that gets them a place so they can reach their potential, not end up being a soldier or belonging to a faction or another. We want them to find their own way to survive and build their resiliency, to continue to claim a degree of human dignity that gets them to move beyond being victims and enemies.
Thank you, Huda. And just to close that story about Women Wage Peace that Huda mentioned, and she was integral in that organization being founded, it's now 50,000 people strong. And on the 21st of September this month, they will be doing a cross-border activity on International Peace Day, where that capacity that, again, Huda advised them to build that internal Israeli capacity first. It's 50,000 strong. It's now been taken over the Green Line on a joint women-led march to the Jordan Valley in the coming weeks. So that's kind of a good example, I guess, of that longer-term strategy building toward a greater impact. Jonathan, over to you for the questions and answer session.
Thank you so much, John and Meredith and Huda. My first question is, can we absolutely guarantee an opportunity to meet with you in person when Heart of a Nation comes to Israel and Palestine in January? I'm going to hold you to your answers. So Huda gave a thumbs up, Meredith, a commitment, and John, I can't thank you enough for sharing so honestly, so candidly, so openly, so expansively. I'm going to very quickly bring people into this conversation. I'm going to ask them to indicate one way or another that they have a question that they'd like to pose. If your question is actually a comment, please keep an eye on the time because we'd like to hear from as many people as possible. As you're thinking and formulating, and I'm waiting to see a hand or an indication, a wave that you're looking to speak, let me just look at some of the comments that have come in. Alex, can you pose your comment in the form of a question? And then Muna, can you do that as well?
And Jonathan, Emily Zimmern has her hand raised as well.
Great. So let's take Emily as well. We've got those three. Alex?
I don't think I have a question. It was just appreciating what Huda said and wanting to just respond to it. So I don't have any questions at the moment, at least. Thank you.
Well said, Alex. Muna?
Thank you, Habibi. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm grateful and thankful to have a heads up on this. This is my heart and this is my prayer and this is my desire, is dialogue and changing I love what has been said about the content of the word when it is spoken. We all, in many ways, when we speak, we create. And when that creation happens, the environment gets affected. So it's each one of us need to be responsible to the content of the words we speak. Sometimes we repeat them because the media said them or the indoctrination has been going on for years. So we adapt to them without any consideration to the listener and how it affects them on the ground. So bridge building and common grounds is pivotal to a peace process. We've heard peace so many times. My question is it peace that we are really looking for? Or is it human beings recognizing each other and try to make their neighbor on both sides live comfortably with full respect to who they are as human beings?
Mona, thank you. These words matter so much. Peace, justice, human dignity, and compassion. John, want to respond, pass it to Huda or Meredith, or should I bring Emily into the conversation?
I'm happy to very quickly give my view, but obviously Huda's and Meredith's are more important on the ground. I mean, maybe the thing that I'll talk about is in the Irish example of this, and that, you know, there's a Disneyland idea of peace processes. Sometimes it's in our interest to try and talk about it in those terms, and we're trying to convince a member of Congress or a diplomat, but the lived reality day to day, it's, you know, it's tougher. And in the Northern Irish context, you know, it's imperfect. And it's something every single day, to your question, Muna, people need to get up and treat each other with this minimum level of dignity that many of us would take for granted, but that in its absence will catalyze violent ethnic conflict. And that's a daily behavior. It's not a destination you get to, it's a way of being and a process. But the good news is, the longer you see that adaptation socially, the more, to be frank, older generations who came up during a time when that was not the sort of modus operandi in the streets, they sort of go to the back, new generation comes to the fore, and suddenly the floor gets raised, right? As bad as things can get, the floor is that bit higher than it used to be. So when things go bad, certain acts of violence get taken off the table. And if you can incrementally keep moving in that direction, it also allows you to put questions on the table that people are terrified of otherwise. right? So you talked about justice, Jonathan, earlier. That word terrifies people on either side of conflicts very often. Whereas when you take the pressure out and the immediate risk of violence as being the kind of automatic reaction, suddenly those very difficult questions can be put on a table without everybody losing their minds. And what I'm seeing in Northern Ireland now, which is really interesting, is questions around identity that were totally taboo are now front and center for a generation tackling them for the first time. And there's no reason in the world why that same process can't take place amongst Israelis and Palestinians.
Can I
bring, yes, who's speaking now?
Huda.
Huda, please, and then Emily.
Mona, this is a very good question, and this is part of the conversation that we will have as a community. But for me, peace is when I see kids playing together, speaking English, Hebrew, Arabic interchangeably. They get their names. They can go back home safely. They can get a warm meal. They have sane parents taking care of them. They grow in a way that they can decide on their identity, who they should be, whether it's nationally, sexually, or even socially, to what group they want to belong to. For me, is to see these kids playing in this place that doesn't tell them what they should be. And from there, and I want to bring women and mothers to the vision of peace, because we forget sometimes that they are the ones who are on the receiving end of pain and loss and trauma. And they are the ones who spend most of the time with these kids who are going to grow up in this environment. We do what we can do as parents. And I'm not a parent, I chose not to, but I have 33 nieces and nephews that I don't want them to grow thinking that they are less or more than any other person on earth. And they have the same privileges and rights like everyone else. And I know this is not possible anywhere in the world, but at least they live by these principles. So that's peace for me personally.
Fabulous. Thank you, Huda. Emily?
Sorry. Well, thank you, John and Meredith and Huda, for your absolutely inspiring and informative presentation. My question is, there was a comment about the need to change the theories of change that the organizations in Israel and in Palestine need to use to move into peace building. So could you comment on that? I'm not sure who, or if you can send us links. I mean, I think that's a fascinating issue as someone who's worked with nonprofits extensively in the US. And then a follow-up, which is for all of us, what can we do from here to help support that initiative?
Excellent. Meredith, can you jump in?
Yeah, sure. So without using too much jargon, Emily, I'll try to tell you a bit about what we're talking about. And so I'm actually happy, Huda, we're speaking, I think, right after Sukkot, to hear the final analysis from the needs assessment, and to hear that the Palestinian NGOs are asking for program monitoring and evaluation is really encouraging me to finish. We're working, Emily, on tools that we've been developing, where we guide the NGOs through a process of figuring out what is the problem they're trying to solve, right? And it's actually extremely difficult. They start with, the conflict, the occupation, injustice, right? Like all of these big pieces, and we bring them down to, what the unique specific element of the conflict that they specifically are addressing, and how does their work specifically actually contribute toward that element, that specific problem's end. And then we help them work on a conflict analysis of, if that problem in the conflict is solved, how does that contribute toward the bigger picture? We do that within a mapping of where they fit into the field, and we do a mapping with them of what are their capacities to actually do that. Do they have resources they need? Do they have the staff that they need, right? And are they accomplishing it? How do they measure if they're succeeding? How do they make decisions based in making sure that they're trying to accomplish their mission, and to just change the way that they're thinking, that everything is constantly mission driven, and that if all decisions are rooted in this, then they'll be operating more strategically. And so it's part of a shared theory of change that each individual organization can't make peace by itself, but that if we understand the larger landscape and we know what our individual role as an organization is, and each person knows their role in the organization and how they contribute to that, to organization success, then as a movement, we're able to actually create change together and measure it.
Amazing. Robbie, you sent me a personal note. I wonder if you have a thought or a question, or might want to bring in some of the cultural dimensions that you're so involved with. Are you on mute?
Let's not forget Emily's follow-up question.
I was just starting to write.
Emily's follow-up question is going to be the most important
the crown, yeah.
topic. And Robbie, I don't think you ever got off mute, but if you're okay with a couple minutes left, we have to address Emily's follow-up question, because that's really the question that all of us at Heart of a Nation and our entire community of purpose is wrestling with. What can we do to support the essential work that we've just heard described? What can we do here in the United States? What can we do in Israel? And what can we do in Palestine? And how can those of us committed to this effort come together to be a support system for those of you who are devoting blood, sweat, and tears to these efforts?
I'm happy to take the first swing at that. So a couple of things. Thank you for your question, first of all, Emily. The one thing I'd have to say is, if you are a US citizen, write to your representatives and tell them how important this work is for you and that it be supported as a priority in the United States. We will need to make sure that this funding is continued and expanded. One thing we didn't talk about is the opportunity for multinational partnership. The United Kingdom has already endorsed this international fund concept. And imagine the United States led now a multilateral project to bring its allies in and expand this already significant investment to many times over what is being committed. That's possible. And the Biden administration and members of Congress can push in that direction if they hear from constituents that it's a priority. The other thing I would say is, I'm going to put a link into the chat. Take a look at our members. There's over 155 organizations there now. I guarantee one of them will speak to you. Drop them a note. Tell them, if you can financially support them, that is fantastic. If you can't do that, even just send them an email and ask, can I help some other way? It's lonely being a peace builder. It can feel, you can feel really isolated. Being in these organizations for a long time, those messages actually matter a lot. And the final thing I'd say, with respect, and I usually limit myself to 3 Northern Irish parallels. I've definitely broken that rule today, but diaspora communities played a game-changing role in Northern Ireland. They went from being, in the 70s and 80s, a big part of the problem, sending guns to Northern Ireland, incentivizing the very worst actors to be even more hardline. They did a 180. And, you know, Irish American philanthropists and community leaders were at the tip of the spear in that. And they, because they got the privilege of not living in the conflict, actually could have the circumspection to say, no, you know what, maybe try this other approach, maybe try take a chance. And they were trusted by their cousins on the ground in ways that other third parties aren't. And I think that's a real opportunity for the Palestinian and Jewish diaspora to try and play that role. And I think if that happened over time, you would see a lot of behavior changing in the region as a result.
John, I think Heart of a Nation has its marching orders there, and I'm not gonna stop at 3, especially if Huda and Meredith have other thoughts.
Absolutely. There are so many ways to get involved. Our mission is really threefold right now. One is to build capacity of the NGOs. And so if you have skills, ideas, connections, relationships, mentorship that you're interested in, we need that. One of the programs that we're building through a project of ours called Embodying Peace is a mentorship program where we're connecting experts from around the world who have skills, who have perspective, who have a little bit of time to give with NGO leaders, with emerging leaders, to be an ear for them, somebody outside of the work, somebody with a different perspective. And if you're interested in joining this new program that we're developing, I would love to connect you to NGO leaders. And I'm sure John and Huda have plenty who are also looking to connect to mentors. Another opportunity is, for the first time, this is really exciting, we are hosting an umbrella fundraising campaign for Israeli and Palestinian peace NGOs. We're doing this in partnership with Bait of Hope, which is another umbrella organization for Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding. And this is going to be a major landing page where you can see at least 10 to 15 grassroots cross-border peacebuilding organizations that are doing crowdfunding for maybe the first, maybe the second time, who have never really done major fundraising online at scale. And we're going to need as many people as possible to be spreading the word and sharing about this campaign. And of course, I mean, we have on ALLMEP's website, on Amal Tikva's website, all of us have, organizations that we would be more than happy to help you figure out who you'd be interested in and what you care about in terms of, joining advisory boards or helping share about their work, and of course, giving to them.
I would say that practically this is amazing, but also on a level of being part of the gang, activists in your own place. Always make sure that when people come to you with claims about the peace building community, that it's benign, it's not doing anything, it's overrated, it's just hugging trees or something. Know that it's more serious than what they are trying to portray, or if it's normalizing or whatever, because because we literally take life risks to meet. And it shouldn't be something that human beings should go through in order to meet. Although in the 60s, this was the case in the United States. We need to amplify the work of the people who are on the ground. I call them the holy stones. If this is a holy land and it has holy stones, there are holy people, but not monks and sheikhs and rabbis. These are the people who believe that this is worth taking risk for. And it's not something to take for granted. We fight sometimes to get a place to meet. We fight to go through the systems to get permits and cross checkpoints to get together to meet. It's very hard to take off certain hats when we are in the room. We do open heart surgeries when we are in the room. And that's how we manage to survive. And when people come to tell you that the Palestinians are normalizing the occupation, tell them that the Palestinians are trying to find a way to reclaim power over their own destiny and change the game from their own perspective, because peace for them is not a strategy, peace for them is a need. And that the Palestinians are not all violent, and the Palestinians are not all Hamas, and they are not all Fatah, and the majority of them are trying to find a way to survive on a daily basis. We want to amplify this work. We want people who, especially people from the academia, who think that this work is just about contact theory, to know that this work is actually changing brains and hearts and attitudes of hardliners on both sides. But they are not brave enough to come out and say that. We are the most courageous now among Palestinians and Israelis, because we are not hiding behind an ideology or a dominant narrative. We're trying to break through these and give a chance to the young generation to reclaim or claim their own identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Huda. Thank you, Meredith. And John, a special thanks to you for working with Heart of a Nation to put this together. I can't think of a more important conversation to have on this anniversary. And we will now work together, I assure you, to figure out ways of actualizing each and every one of the things that you, John, Huda, and Meredith have mentioned. They are action points for us, the best possible roadmap for those of us committed to this generational struggle to change the dynamics in such a way that Palestine, Israel, and America, and especially the most progressive individuals and forces and organizations within those three societies, see themselves as natural, organic partners in the pursuit of peace and justice and human dignity. Thank you all for your participation. We'll be following up with each and every one of you, and hopefully we'll see you again within a couple of weeks when we pull together our next forum. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Salam.
Paul, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Habibati. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Huda.
Bye.